Justice is a word that we hear surprisingly often. Social justice, justice for Palestine, justice for Africa, justice for pretty much anything. But I don't think that in the modern world, the people using the word justice in support of their campaigns really understand what it's supposed to mean. It's a powerful word. It's one that pretty much everyone from a liberal society understands, and we have a deep drawing towards justice, towards fairness, and that's something that is perhaps being used against us. When someone says they want justice, it's very hard for us to say no when we should be, because what these people want is not justice. What got me thinking about this was a quote I came across while I was reading. It's a quote from Edmund Burke, which is, "If I cannot have reform without injustice, I will not have reform." Edmund Burke himself is reasonably interesting. You've probably heard him misquoted numerous times, anything along the lines of all it takes for evil is for good men to do nothing, although he probably didn't say that. It's arguable whether he said this either. I can't find the book that it's supposed to come from, but I have heard him quoted as saying that several times, once by Winston Churchill and once by Bertrand Russell. So I'm going to go with Burke on this. But let's just take that aphorism. If I cannot have reform without injustice, I will not have reform. That's a great statement, like especially from a politician, and a politician in the 1700s at that. It has embedded in it a really strong sense of individual liberty, individual rights, things that today we love, we revel in these ideas today. At its core, in that aphorism, it's not something that anyone could really disagree with. That whenever we make laws, when we change laws, whatever we do, we can't be creating injustice. We must be creating justice, or at the very worst, we must stay as unjust as we are. We cannot get any more unjust than we are now. The thing is that while both the regressives and, the sane, rational human beings of the world would both probably agree with that aphorism, with that sentiment, we both have different ideas of what constitutes justice and injustice. Everyone thinks that the reforms they are championing contain justice within them. No one believes that their reforms are unjust. It's very hard to argue on those fronts, and the only people who genuinely would be campaigning for unjust reforms are, the genuine extremists. They are communists or fascists. So everyone else is on some level believing that their reforms are just. But clearly there's a difference of opinion here. Those on the regressive left think that pretty much anything suggested by anyone else necessitates some injustice in what they're saying. Pretty much everyone else thinks everything suggested by the regressive left has some amount of injustice inside it. So how can both sides believe that what they are saying is just? How can we have such radically different ideas about what is right and fair and just? This is an argument that stems from the individual versus the collective, and from the greater good versus the individual good. Expressed another way, this is a realist, idealist divide as well. But I think that this is best expressed in terms of collective rights versus individual rights. The progressive left seeks for justice for collectives, and does not see infringing on individual rights as being unjust in pursuit of that greater goal. While Mr. Burke would certainly argue that anything that infringes on individual rights is unjust and makes any policy that would do so unacceptable. The regressives would argue that the group rights are bigger and more important than individual rights, and thus if your individual rights need to be sacrificed in order to create justice for blacks or Palestinians or whoever, then that is an acceptable casualty. Their idea of justice is something big. It is something far away, far down the line, somewhere in a perfect society where everything is just and wonderful. I don't think that they are genuinely malicious. I think that they genuinely do believe that they are trying to create a more just world, but they're doing a very, very bad job of it. On a fundamental level, we should not trust anyone who believes that individual rights are something that could or should be sacrificed. And yet, here they are. They are a huge political force. They are something that is out there and is active in politics to such a degree that highly prestigious elected officials everywhere in the world, including here in Britain, have drunk the social justice Kool-Aid. We see our brand new mayor of London saying that he wants to get X number of Asians and women onto the Transport for London Council simply because they are Asian or black or women. That example is quite a prescient one in this case, because he doesn't believe that he is acting unjustly. He thinks that the justice is having, perfect demographic representation, half women, about 10% minorities, something like that. That is justice. And he makes no reference to, the men that would lose their jobs. He makes no comment on actually finding the best people for that role, which is something that hopefully is more important. Individual rights are important because they guarantee us as individual rights not only against each other but against the state, against the power structure. Individual rights give us as individuals power. Those rights must be respected by the courts, by the government, by everyone. They simply cannot ride roughshod over us as individuals. The idea of individual rights says that even if one man would be hurt by this, that is still an injustice, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't do it anyway if the good is big enough, but it does mean that we cannot simply ignore that individual. One person is big enough to stand in the way of governments and nations. It means that no matter how powerful someone is or how popular they are not bigger than one other person's rights. This provides us with a huge amount of protection. You don't need to be someone special, someone protected in order to be protected by your individual rights. The only qualification you need is to be a person. As long as you are a person, you are protected from the machinations of those in power, those with large power bases, with large amounts of money. Breaching those individual rights is a textbook case of injustice. Those rights are fair and just and reasonably applied to everyone. And yet there are those who would say that those individual rights are not just, even though they apply universally to all people. That's because they're looking at collective rights and collective justice, justice for all black people, say. These people believe that since individual rights don't matter, they aren't interested in the individual fallout of the policies that they would introduce, the reforms that they are chasing. I think a really nice low-level example of this is something like quotas, something that's directly counter to individual rights and justice. Its only goal is to force certain kinds of people to be employed where otherwise they would not, where they were not qualified or meritorious enough to receive that role. It is directly unjust that people who have earned that position, who have studied and worked and gained experience, would be denied simply for being the wrong skin colour or gender. That is directly unjust. But to the proponents of group rights and group justice, the just thing is for, perfectly demographic representation of all kinds of people in all areas of everything. Within government, we must have exactly 50% women. We must have exactly, well, in this country, about 6% minorities. And if we don't, that body cannot be just. And it doesn't matter if more qualified people are passed over, because the just thing for white men is to only be represented exactly the proportion that they are allowed, that they are an at-large part of society, and anything more than that is unjust. And it doesn't matter whether they were qualified or whether they worked hard or whether it was simply their turn. It doesn't matter. They get exactly their number of candidates and nothing more. And yet these people would certainly argue that they are trying to create reform without injustice. They would say that they're trying to create justice in the long term, in the larger scale. These people are the social justice warriors, and everything that they do must therefore be just, naturally. But it's not. Even taken as read that they actually would create a just world in the end, something that's certainly up for debate. Even assuming that, using the tools of injustice cannot create justice. The social justice warriors here are arguing very directly that the end justifies the means, that it is okay to be unjust in a good cause. And while that's not necessarily something that's untrue, it behooves us to remember that justice should be a goal of legislation, and creating legislation that is unjust, that creates unfairness, is not something that we can stand for, particularly when there is no obvious reason to believe that it will actually lead to a just society further down the line. But to the proponents of social justice, injustice is acceptable as long as it furthers their goal. And social justice is happy to create those injustices when it suits them, dressed up in the clothes of justice. They use the same contention that ends justify the means that was used for purges and starvation and repression and political murders and horrible things all over the world. Just as the communists and the fascists before them, they are trying to impose any injustice for the sake of their final end goal. And these are just not people that we can trust have anyone's best interests at heart except their own. Their own ideology, their own twisted worldview is the only thing that they are interested in. They do not care about people. Any injustice is wrong, no matter the reason. And this is why we see ridiculous articles arguing that paying women more for just being women would be just fair. That quotas are, in fact, better for everyone, even for men, of course. And that racial segregation is entirely okay when they do it, when it's the black people shutting themselves off and saying they don't want to be near white people anymore. They say that it's impossible to be oppressed and still be unjust. To be the oppressed makes you always just. It cannot be racism against a white guy, because as the oppressed, everything done to you is always unjust and everything you do is always just. Everything that they do is double plus good. It's nonsense doublethink. And it's in total contravention to the world that we actually see around us. Every argument they make is, at its core, exactly this ends justify the means kind of logic. They're saying we will use injustice to create justice. We'll use inequality to create equality. They're arguing that it's a legitimate use of power to impose injustice on people, and that's simply not something we can stand for. It is not a legitimate use of power to create injustice. Anyone who is espousing that is completely wrong, and they must be stopped. Because if we allow them to impose injustice legitimately through the democratic process, they will do so again and again. If we say it's acceptable to impose injustice, then it will not stop, because any one injustice, no matter how small, validates every other injustice. If it is okay to discriminate against a white guy for being white, then it must be okay to discriminate against a black guy for being black, and that is not something that I think anyone wants to see. Every injustice validates every other injustice. If we give them the power, if we allow them to institute injustices with it, it will never stop, and they will never give that power back. They claim that they are trying to create reform without injustice, but what they see as being injustice is, in fact, entirely mistaken. They would argue that a quota law is creating reform without injustice, not seeing that it immediately will and in fact must create injustice, that their great sweeping reform without injustice is in fact a reform that creates injustice, and that is something that needs to be resisted, that any rational person needs to argue against, because if we cannot have a reform without injustice, then we will not have reform. And that goes for everything they say, everything, because everything they want to do is creating reforms for injustice. I'm the political animal, and I am reasonably just.